Hercule Poirot, and the voice recorded in the mirror frame. Chapter 1. The Greenhouse Mirror d'Ortef. Night was slowly descending on the Wetherall estate, enveloping its gardens in a silvery mist as the greenhouse, constructed of antique glass and wrought iron, glowed with a soft light that seemed to have come from another century. Inside, Mrs. Rowena Wetherall, an elegant widow with a soft voice and a deliberate gait, was pouring herself a glass of sherry, while staring at her reflection in an antique Victorian mirror hanging at the far end of the greenhouse. There was something peculiar about the mirror. Its carved mahogany frame seemed to observe her more than she observed her own reflection. The object had belonged to her late husband, Algernon Wetherall, an eccentric collector obsessed with 19th-century objects and the preservation of secrets, as he liked to say. It had been found at an auction in Vienna and placed there, among the orchids and vines, like a silent guardian. That night, however, the silence was interrupted by a muffled shriek. The housemaid, a nervous young woman named Elsie, found Mrs. Wetherall collapsed on the floor, the glass broken beside her, and a small mechanical device barely protruding from the mirror frame. A phonograph cylinder, the kind used in old-fashioned recordings. The police were immediately called. Inspector Hargreaves, a practical and unimaginative man, ordered the frame taken down. What they found was disconcerting. An incomplete recording that began with a man's voice. A hoarse, static-affected whisper saying, "Rowena, you know what you did, and you know you're not alone." The next day, Mrs. Wetherall was found dead in her bed. There were no signs of violence, but there was an expression of indescribable terror on her face. And beside her, on the nightstand, was a letter written in blue ink and unsigned. "You shouldn't have looked in the mirror." A week later, in a first-class carriage bound for Kent, Hercule Poirot was closing the clasp of his briefcase with mathematical precision. Opposite him, Captain Hastings was leafing through a newspaper, his expression increasingly intrigued. "Well, mon ami?" asked Poirot, without looking up from his neatly arranged gloves. "What new mystery does that surprised hare's expression provoke?" "It's a strange case, Poirot," Hastings replied, turning the newspaper toward him. "Woman dead after listening to anonymous recording hidden in antique mirror. The police don't know if it was suicide, a fright, or murder by psychological means." Poirot raised an eyebrow and delicately took the newspaper. "A murder by suggestion. Ah, what a delightfully intriguing subject. And if I'm not mistaken, isn't the address Wetherall Hall, near Maidstone? Exact." Poirot nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Curious, because I was invited to that very estate this afternoon, by young Edgar Wetherall, nephew of the deceased. He writes to me in an urgent and bewildered tone. Mon ami Hastings, I fear this. Mirror reflects more than faces. It reflects secrets. And you know how I feel about secrets. They always end up revealing themselves," Hastings said. "Exactly." The train whistled as it entered the rural station, and as dusk gilded the Kentish countryside, two figures gracefully stepped off the carriage. The meticulous Belgian detective and his eternal companion. What they didn't yet know was that the crime that awaited them wasn't measured in blood, but in whispers, reflections, and a voice that shouldn't exist. Chapter 2. The inhabitants of Wetherell Hall. The morning mist had not yet dissipated when the taxi carrying Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings drove up the winding drive to Wetherell Hall. It was a severe mansion, partially covered in ivy, with an air of faded dignity, as if the walls themselves were silent out of respect for recent grief. Poirot descended slowly, examining the facade with half-closed eyes. "A house with a memory," he murmured, "and like all memories, selective in what it chooses to show." A white-haired butler with measured manners, who introduced himself as Dinsmore, led them through the spacious foyer to a room decorated in shades of dark green, where the house's inhabitants awaited. The atmosphere was thick, charged not only by tragedy, but by the pent-up emotions that palpable like static electricity. In a corner, sitting with his shoulders hunched and his face drawn, was Edgar Wetherell. He was a young man, perhaps 30, with a permanently tense expression. He stood up when he saw Poirot enter and shook his hand firmly. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you for coming. I don't know if this qualifies as a crime, but something's not right. My Aunt Rowena, she wouldn't have died like that. She wasn't superstitious or nervous. Tell me everything, monsieur," said Poirot, taking his seat with mathematical precision, Hastings at his side. "But first, could you introduce me to the others?" Edgar made a somewhat hesitant gesture. "Of course, my fiancée, Miss Clarissa Ashcombe." A young woman with light hair and an inquisitive look nodded elegantly. She wore a sober dress and a blue enamel star-shaped brooch. She didn't smile. "My cousin Giles Wetherell, Algernon's son from his first marriage." Giles was a thin man in his 40s, with a rigid posture and an expression that oscillated between annoyance and scepticism. He simply bowed his head. "Miss Violet Carr, a close friend of my aunt's for years. She's been living with us since her husband passed away." A middle-aged woman, dressed in strict black, with thin lips and long fingers interlaced in her lap. Her tone was cold but measured. "It's an honour to have him here, Monsieur Poirot." Edgar seemed to hesitate before adding, "And finally, Miss Elsie Chapman, the housemaid, who was the first to discover the phonograph in the mirror." Elsie was young, with a pale face and frightened eyes. She bowed briefly, without speaking. Poirot watched each face carefully, as if their expressions were revealing an internal score to him. "Where is the mirror now?" "Kept in the study," Edgar replied. "We took it apart after my aunt's death. Inspector Hargreaves examined it, but found no signs of recent tampering." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And the cylinder? It's locked in a safe." "The inspector took it, but he left a copy of the recording. I have a phonograph if you'd like to hear it." "Very soon. First, I'd like to know more about the dynamics of this house." Clarissa, who had remained silent until now, intervened. Madame Wetherell was demanding but fair. She had a clear vision for the future of this estate and who should inherit it. "And that caused friction?" Poirot asked gently. "Of course you did," Giles snapped with a brusque gesture. "Forgive me, but pretending this house was paradise is absurd. Rowena was a tyrant disguised as a lady. She changed her will 3 times, and just before she died, it was rumoured she would do it again." Poirot turned to Edgar. "Is that true, sir?" Edgar tensed. "I don't know. She said a lot of things, but she never acted without thinking twice. Her lawyer hasn't confirmed anything. Yet. Poirot slowly interlaced his fingers. And the night the phonograph was found. Elsie, trembling, raised her voice. I'd brought his sherry glass, as usual, and I found it on the floor. He seemed to have dropped it in shock. The cylinder was barely sticking out of the frame. I'd never seen that before, I swear. No one else had access to the greenhouse. The place wasn't locked, monsieur, Violet chimed in. Rowena considered it a sanctuary, but she trusted no one would desecrate it. Poirot nodded slowly. And you, messieurs and messiahs, do you all remember where you were on the night of the discovery? I was in the library with Clarissa, Edgar said quickly. Me in my study, preparing some documents. Giles added without emotion. Me in my room, Violet whispered, like always at that hour. I cleaned the east wing, Elsie added. The wing that's hardly used now. Hastings exchanged a glance with Poirot, but the detective remained impassive. Thank you. As many versions as there are clocks in a ballroom. And yet they all seem to have something to hide, he said gently. He stood up calmly. Now, I'd like to see the mirror and hear the voice that shouldn't have spoken. Chapter 3. The Echo of a Recording. The study at Wetherell Hall was a long, dark wood-panelled room with a library of leather-bound volumes and a large oak desk facing a south-facing window. In one corner, on a side table, rested the dismantled mirror, covered with a linen cloth. Beside it, an antique phonograph waited, silently. Poirot approached with soft steps, closely followed by Hastings and Edgar. With an almost ritual bow, the detective drew back the cloth, revealing the mirror. Even when unhinged, the object seemed to retain a certain authority, as if observing rather than reflecting. Poirot inclined his head slightly, examining the frame with his gloved fingers. The carving is Baroque, undoubtedly from the mid-19th century. I see traces of new varnish. Did anyone restore it recently? My aunt had it cleaned a few months ago. An antique dealer from Maidstone came to do it right here, Edgar replied. Name? I think his last name was Cotterill. George Cotterill. We'll remember that, Poirot murmured, his eyes fixed on a discreet spot on the side of the frame, where a small indentation suggested the possible location of the compartment where the cylinder was hidden. Poirot didn't try to open it. Instead, he turned to the phonograph. Now, monsieur, make him talk. Edgar gently placed the wax cylinder over the mechanism and lowered the needle. A faint creak emerged from the brass speaker, followed by a few seconds of piercing silence, as if the machine were hesitating to relive the past. Then a voice emerged, raspy, distorted, disturbingly intimate. Rowena, you know what you did, and you know you're not alone. Poirot remained motionless. Not a muscle on his face betrayed any emotion. When the recording stopped, silence settled again in the room, as heavy as a slab. Hastings cleared his throat. A veiled threat. Sounds like blackmail, doesn't it? Poirot raised a hand. Listen to it again, Hastings. Not as a threat, but as a coded confession. The tone isn't aggressive, it's theatrical. Someone trying to provoke fear, yes, but with measured words. Prepared. So you think it was recorded on purpose to scare her? Exactly. And the language. You know you're not alone. That's a carefully chosen phrase. Ambiguous. Capable of taking root in the mind. Poirot turned to Edgar. Do you recognize the voice? The young man hesitated. No, at least not for sure. It could be any man of a certain age, if you ask me. And you, Hastings? Hastings shook his head. Hard to tell. Too much static. Exactly, Poirot agreed. The static. Too deliberate to be accidental. As if a filter had been placed between the voice and us. That requires technical intent. A tampered cylinder. He approached the mirror again. How much time passed between the cleaning of the mirror and the discovery of the cylinder? About 2 months. But the mirror was reinstalled without any unusual signs, Edgar explained. Poirot touched the edge of the frame. So whoever inserted the cylinder had access to the mirror later, or they did so at that very moment with the help of the antique dealer, if there was collusion. The detective covered the mirror with the cloth again and turned around. Good. Hastings, let's go back to the living room. I want to observe you all one more time, but this time under the light of fear. The inhabitants of Wetherell Hall were gathered together again. This time, without the courtesy of an initial introduction, Poirot scanned them silently. Only then did he speak. I've listened to the recording, and I'll tell you what I see. A house divided, a death that seems to leave no physical marks, but emotional ones, and a message designed to paralyze not a superstitious woman, but a woman who knew something. Clarissa, sitting on the edge of an armchair, asked, Do you think someone caused her to die? Perhaps not directly, Poirot replied, but the mind can be a more accurate weapon than a knife, mademoiselle. If one succeeds in instilling the right fear, at the right moment, he turned to Giles. You mentioned that the will was going to be changed. Do you know who the inheritance was going to? Giles pressed his lips together. I don't know, but it wasn't going to be me. I was sure of that. And you, Miss Carr? Violet, standing like a plaster figure, answered without flinching. I never asked Rowena about money matters. Our relationship was deeper than that. Poirot inclined his head slightly. And you, Clarissa, were you aware of Monsieur Edgar's financial situation? Just enough to know that he depended on his aunt. But Edgar wouldn't do anything to scare her. He truly loved her. Edgar, visibly affected, nodded gravely. That's right. I want justice, Poirot. I don't know what happened, but it wasn't natural. Poirot turned to Elsie, who was shifting uncomfortably. And you, mademoiselle? Do you know if anyone visited the greenhouse those days? The young woman shook her head quickly. No one, sir. But one night before the lady died, I saw a light in the greenhouse, very late. I thought maybe she had gone downstairs. I didn't want to disturb you. And did you mention it to anyone? No, sir. I didn't think it was important. Poirot crossed his arms, his eyes shining with renewed interest. Au contraire, mademoiselle. Everything is important, especially when you want to kill without leaving traces. When they left the drawing-room, Poirot walked slowly down the central corridor, stopping in front of an oil portrait of Algernon Wetherell. He looked at it for a few seconds before speaking. Hastings, this crime isn't one of impulse. It's a work built with time, patience, and intimate knowledge. We won't be looking for a confession, we'll be looking for a crack. Because even the most polished mirror, if you look at it long enough, reveals a fracture. Chapter 4. The Flame in the Greenhouse. Night descended like a thick blanket over the gardens of Wetherell Hall, silencing the gravel paths and drowning out even the murmur of the fountains. Poirot, however, was not resting. After a silent dinner where the tensions weren't disguised by silverware or fine wine, he asked permission to walk alone through the grounds. Hastings watched him from an upstairs window, concerned by the detective's thin figure pacing the shadows with meticulous steps. Half an hour later, Poirot returned to the hall, his eyes slightly aglow, as if the night breeze had swept away some mental veil. "Hastings, come with me. We're going to the greenhouse." "Now, what did you see?" "Nothing. But that's precisely what I want to check. If there's nothing in the greenhouse, or if someone has made sure it looks empty." The two men went out into the garden with an oil lamp and walked in silence under the bare autumn trees. The greenhouse, some distance from the main house, loomed like a glass bubble in the low fog. Its steamed panes seemed to hold more than moisture. Memories, perhaps. Poirot pushed open the wrought-iron gate and entered. The air was thick and damp, with the scent of damp earth, dried flowers, and something else indefinable, a sour, metallic note. "I smell the past, Hastings," Poirot murmured. "But I also smell fear." The detective walked among the orchid pots, running his fingers along the edges of the planters. He stopped next to the pedestal where the mirror used to hang. He looked at the hook still sticking out of the wall. "See this? The dust here has been disturbed recently. Not enough to indicate a thorough cleaning, but certainly recent tampering. Someone took the mirror apart with more haste than care." Poirot raised the lamp towards the ceiling, revealing the fine network of cobwebs that decorated the beams. And yet, no one cleaned up here. Why do such a selective job? Because they were only interested in one thing, the frame. Hastings, always one step behind, murmured, "But what did they expect to find?" Poirot turned, lowering the lamp until it shone on the base of a large flower pot. A modern tape recorder, perhaps, or an alternative cylinder to replace the original. Someone was rehearsing, mon ami. This crime was staged like a theatrical performance. The mirror was just the curtain. A dull sound interrupted his thoughts. Something had fallen from the other side of the greenhouse. Poirot immediately turned off the lamp. Silence. The two men stood motionless. In the gloom, the faint crunch of a footstep was heard. Then, a sudden flash, a spark, followed by a small flame that climbed from the edge of a forgotten linen curtain. "Fire!" Hastings shouted. Poirot rushed to a copper watering can, pouring its contents onto the nascent flames. Hastings followed suit with another nearby bucket. Within seconds the fire was extinguished, leaving behind a smell of burnt cloth and damp ash. Poirot was breathing heavily, but his eyes shone brightly. "Someone tried to cover their tracks tonight, Hastings. It wasn't an accident. What if he was still here?" Hastings asked, looking around. Poirot shook his head. "Too late, but it doesn't matter. Now I know for sure that this crime lives on in the recent past. Everything was rehearsed, every detail. The mirror, the voice, the letter, and now the fire. As they left the greenhouse, they saw Edgar running from the main house, wearing a bathrobe and looking alarmed. "What happened? Are you okay?" "Perfectly," replied Poirot. "But not the greenhouse. Someone tried to set fire to a curtain. If we hadn't been there—" Edgar paled. "Fire! Oh, my God! And why?" "Monsieur," Poirot interrupted gently, "could you call your aunt's lawyer for me tomorrow? I'd like to speak to him as soon as possible." "Of course, Mr. Marbury. He'll be here the day after tomorrow to read the will. But I can call him. Do it. And one last thing. Where were you tonight, monsieur?" "In my room, reading. Clarissa can confirm we were together until almost 10. Poirot nodded, as if the answer was part of a planned pattern. "Thank you. I appreciate your honesty. Good night." Later, back in his room, Poirot neatly took off his shoes and sat by the open window. Hastings watched him silently, noting how the detective's mind worked even in the stillness. "Do you think the culprit was the one who tried to burn down the greenhouse? Maybe. Or maybe it was someone more nervous than criminal. Someone afraid the theatre they put on might fall apart. Hastings, the key isn't in the recorded voice, but in who was afraid of what Rowena might say, or had already said. And the letter." Poirot smiled. That letter wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. Mrs. Wetherall was about to confess something, and that something was powerful enough for someone to plot her death without touching her. Poirot stood up slowly. "Tomorrow we'll interrogate the antique dealer, and then we'll return to observe the suspects. This time with different eyes." "What eyes?" "Those of someone who knows that lies aren't linear. They're circular, mon ami. They always return to where they started." Chapter 5. The Antiquaries. Confession. The carriage moved slowly through the narrow streets of Maidstone, shaking slightly with each uneven cobblestone. Poirot, impeccably dressed as always, gazed out the window with his fingers interlaced and a slight frown. Beside him, Hastings flipped through the letter of introduction Edgar had given them that morning. George Cotterell, antique dealer since 1911, specializing in Victorian-era furniture and decorative objects. His shop is called The Widow's Trinkets. What a evocative name, Hastings commented. "Too evocative, perhaps," Poirot replied. "But in these cases there's always value in appearances. Sometimes they're disguises, other times involuntary confessions." The carriage stopped in front of a small shop with a dusty window, where porcelain figurines shared space with grandfather clocks, inkwells, and a pair of eyeless dolls. A wooden sign read, "Objects with History." Poirot entered first, ringing the bell hanging on the door. The interior smelled of aged varnish, old paper, and a hint of damp. Behind a mahogany counter, a wiry man with a sharp beard and round glasses looked up. "Yeah? Mr. Cotterell, good morning." I introduced myself. "Hercule Poirot. This is Captain Hastings. We've come to talk to you about a mirror you recently restored at Wetherall Hall." The man blinked behind his glasses, and for a second a hint of tension crossed his face. "Oh, of course, the mahogany mirror. A very unique one. Its frame was worn, with small compartments that might have been ornamental or functional. I heard Mrs. Wetherall died. I'm sorry." Did you have full access to the object during its restoration? Absolutely. I cleaned it, reinforced the internal joints, even readjusted a panel that seemed loose. I didn't notice any hidden mechanisms, if that's what you're suggesting. Poirot took a step closer to the counter. And yet, sir, when it was taken apart after Madame Wetherell's death, a phonograph cylinder was found inside, one containing a disturbing message. You're telling me you didn't put it there, or find it there? The antique dealer swallowed. Then, with a sigh, he walked around the counter and sat down in a high-backed chair. I didn't put it there, but I did see it. Hastings straightened. Did you see it? Yes, Cotterill said, lowering his voice. As I was taking the frame apart, I noticed a small slot with something stuck in it. It was a cylinder, wrapped in a thin cloth. I carefully pulled it out. I thought it was part of the decorative system, some kind of strange addition. But out of sheer curiosity, I tried it on my phonograph. And did you hear it? The antique. Dealer nodded slowly. I heard the voice. That threat. It stopped me in my tracks. It said, "You know what you did." And he repeated it, as if he were talking to a ghost. Poirot watched him closely. And what did you do? I didn't know what to think. I didn't want to get into trouble. I wrapped it up and put it back exactly as it was. No one would know I'd touched it. I'd only been hired to clean, not to become a confidant of family secrets. Did you recognize the voice? Cotterill firmly denied. No, but it was artificial, or so it seemed to me. As if someone had disguised the tone. I thought the voice wasn't meant for Mrs. Wetherell. It was meant to frighten, as if the whole thing was a staged performance. Poirot turned slightly towards Hastings, then returned to the antique shop. Who exactly hired him? Edgar, the young man. He paid me directly. And did anyone else know? Not that I know of. Just the maid, Elsie, who brought me tea one afternoon. Very kind, by the way. She seemed quite interested in the mirror, but didn't ask any questions. Poirot bent down, picking up a small magnifying glass from the display case. Last question. Mr. Cotterill, when exactly did the restoration take place? 2 months ago, in the second week of September. Poirot smiled politely. Thank you, sir. I appreciate your honesty. If you remember anything else, please don't hesitate to contact me. A crime, even if committed with words, leaves traces, invisible to the eye, but not to reason. Back in the carriage, Poirot remained silent for several minutes, watching the landscape pass by the window. Finally he spoke. He's not guilty, but he's key. Because he knew what was inside? Not only that, because someone wanted me to see it and ignore it. The culprit relies on other people's fear. A born manipulator. This voice, Hastings, isn't just a threat. It's a retort. Someone else has heard that phrase before. Someone who said it, or who was told it. Hastings frowned. Do you mean that this threat already existed in another context? Exactly. And whoever put her in that mirror didn't do it just to scare people. They did it to evoke a memory, to turn a memory into a weapon. So you think the murder was emotional rather than physical? Precisely, my friend, a crime of the spirit. Mrs. Wetherell died of fear, yes, but of a deeply personal fear. A fear with deep roots. Poirot crossed his arms. We need to return to Wetherell Hall. This time, I want to speak with Violet Carr, alone. Do you think she... I don't know what she did, but I do know one thing. In every theatrical scene, there's an actress who knows more than she lets on. And Madame Carr, she knows every curtain. Chapter 6. The Lady of the Shadows. Shh! Evening mist was slowly dissipating over the grounds of Wetherall Hall when Poirot and Hastings returned from Maidstone. The sun, already low on the horizon, filtered an amber light that gave the windows an almost ecclesiastical quality. Poirot silently watched the reflections on the glass, as if hoping to find in them the echo of a still-hidden truth. Dinsmore, the butler, greeted them with his usual courteous dignity. When Poirot asked him to inform Miss Violet Carr that he wished to speak to her privately, the man didn't hide even the slightest hint of surprise. "Of course, monsieur. Miss Carr usually has tea alone in the blue room at this time." "Perfect. Don't disturb him. I'll go myself," replied Poirot. The blue room, an intimate room with grey silk walls and heavy curtains, exuded an air of seclusion. Violet Carr was there, as the butler had predicted, sitting by the unlit fireplace with a still steaming cup of tea in her hands. Seeing Poirot, she didn't rise, but she did raise her chin serenely. "Monsieur Poirot, to what do I owe the honour?" "In memory, mademoiselle. In memory of a woman who died without her secrets being heard. May I sit?" Of course. Poirot did it with precision, as if even the angle of his seat were part of an invisible equation. This house, Miss Carr, has seen many emotions, but few confessions. You knew Mrs. Wetherall better than anyone. A friend of years, a companion, almost a confidant. Am I mistaken? No, Rowena and I shared a lot, although that didn't make us identical. I understand that. I'm interested to know how you reacted to hearing the recorded voice in the mirror. I was told you were present when it first played. I was, Violet said, lowering her gaze slightly, and it was disturbing. Why did you recognize her? A slight, almost imperceptible shudder ran through her body. Then Violet carefully placed the cup back on its saucer. No, because it reminded me of something Rowena told me years ago, after her husband Algernon passed away. One night, during one of our conversations, she mentioned that he had secrets, that his voice still haunted her. I thought it was just a figure of speech, but now I'm not so sure. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Do you think that recording was an imitation of your husband's voice? Perhaps, or a mockery of her. In any case, Rowena was convinced that Algernon had cheated on her, not with another woman, but with someone in his own circle. And she always believed that someone had power over her, even after his death. Did you suspect anyone in particular? He never said so. But over time, he began to distrust even Edgar. And Giles, of course, although he never completely broke off relations. Poirot nodded slowly, then crossed his legs and changed his tone slightly. Miss Carr, let me be frank. You've lived here for years. You're not just a friend, but part of the emotional furniture of this house. It seems to me there are things you haven't said. Not to hide them, but because you didn't consider them relevant. But in a crime like this, what seems insignificant is often decisive. Violet stared at him silently. The crackling of the mantel clock filled the space between their breaths. Finally, she said, The night before she died, Rowena called me into her room. She was very upset. She said she'd received a letter that spoke of the past, but in the ink of the present. She asked me not to tell anyone, not even Edgar. And you obeyed. Yes, I left her alone. The next morning, she was dead. Poirot straightened with a grave expression. Do you know if that letter was found? No. I checked the room afterward, discreetly. There was no sign of her, not in the fire or in her drawers. Could someone else have stolen it? Everyone had access to their room, in theory. But there's something else. Poirot looked at her with renewed interest. Forward. Rowena mentioned a name I hadn't heard in years. She said, "He's back, Violet, not as a man, but as a shadow." I didn't know what she meant. Poirot stood up slowly, as if burdened by the fragility of that memory. "Thank you, mademoiselle. I assure you it has been more revealing than you think." When he left the Blue Room, he found Hastings in the hallway, waiting for him. Anything new? A lot. Now we know there was a lost letter, a phrase spoken on the eve of death, and a fear that wasn't born in the present, but was reactivated. So it all comes back to Algernon? Perhaps not him in the flesh, but what his figure symbolized: secrets, inheritances, betrayals, and above all, control. Hastings, we must locate that will as soon as possible. And the letter, because those two pieces, one legal and one emotional, could be the missing link. What if the letter was destroyed? Poirot smiled slightly. Not every letter is destroyed by fire. Some survive in the words of the person who read it, or in the fear of the person who wrote it. He stopped in front of a decorative table in the hallway. On top of it was a blue porcelain vase. Do you know what differentiates truth from porcelain, my friend? Which? Porcelain breaks and is visible. The truth breaks and is hidden. Chapter 7. The Will That Was Not Read. The next morning brought an overcast sky, with low clouds hanging like grey curtains over the rooftops of Wetherell Hall. The bare branches of the oaks seemed to silently point to the horizon, and the wind blew dry leaves along the garden paths, with a melancholy insistence. Inside the house, the mood was no less gloomy. At 11 o'clock sharp, just as announced, Mr. Lionel Marbury, the family lawyer for more than 2 decades, arrived. Tall, with thinning, slicked-back hair, round glasses, and a perfectly waxed leather briefcase, Mr. Marbury had the composure of a man who had dealt with many wealthy families and far too many secrets. In the library, the group gathered with barely concealed tension. Edgar, Clarissa, Giles, Violet, and even young Elsie, who had been allowed to watch the reading at Poirot's request. The Belgian detective sat discreetly by the fireplace, observing, as always, more than he let on. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marbury began, placing the briefcase on the desk and removing a sealed envelope. "This is the current will of Mrs. Rowena Wetherell, dated February 17th of this year. Unless subsequently amended, this document establishes her final wishes." He opened the envelope with a silver knife and began to read in a clear and firm voice. "I, Rowena Wetherell, being of sound mind, declare this my last will and testament. To my nephew, Edgar Wetherell, I bequeath the ownership of the estate with all its furnishings, collections, and personal effects, as well as the administration of the attached bank accounts." A faint sigh ran through the room. Edgar didn't react, but Clarissa interlaced her fingers more tightly. Marbury continued. To my niece-in-law, Clarissa Ashcombe, an annual income of £600, to be paid on the 1st of January each year. To my friend and companion Violet Carr, the lifelong use of the west wing of the house, and a lump sum of £1,000. To Giles Wetherall, to whom I am fond but also estranged, a sum of £500. Giles snorted, barely audible. Poirot raised an eyebrow without moving another muscle. And finally, I stipulate that if new evidence, papers, or confessions are discovered after my death, you will contact Mr. Hercule Poirot, detective, whose discretion and clarity I admire. I trust he will do justice, should justice be denied, me in life. A deathly silence fell over the room as the will was signed. Everyone's eyes fell on Poirot, who, unperturbed, rose with his usual composure. Interesting, he said, not because of what's being handed out, but because of what isn't mentioned. What do you mean? Giles asked with barely contained disdain. To the letter, monsieur. The letter Rowena received the night before she died. It wasn't included in this will, because it evidently arrived after it was written. But if Mrs. Wetherall intended to change its provisions, then the important thing isn't the content of the will, but the document that would have replaced it. Marbury nodded gravely. There's the possibility of a codicil. 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Wetherall wrote to me asking to arrange a meeting to draft one. She never got around to it. She told me she was re-evaluating certain loyalties. Did you keep that letter? Asked Poirot. Of course, I brought it with me. The lawyer handed a smaller, unsealed envelope, and Poirot examined it carefully. The paper bore traces of wet ink, and Rowena's handwriting was shakier than on previous notes, but still firm. The message was brief. Mr. Marbury, I wish to discuss an important amendment to my will. I trust you'll understand the urgency. Some ties prove to be weaker than they appear, others stronger than I admit. I look forward to receiving you this week. R.W. Poirot let out a slight sigh. There you have it. An interrupted movement, an unexecuted intention, which makes this crime, if it's a crime at all, twofold. First, a woman was killed. Second, that woman's will was killed. Clarissa looked at him uneasily. Do you think someone deliberately prevented you from writing that codicil? It's possible. Perhaps he knew his position within the will was unstable. Perhaps he feared being excluded completely, or exposed. And why does he mention you in the will? Violet asked. Poirot smiled slightly. Because Rowena Wetherall apparently didn't fully trust any of you. After the others had left the room, Poirot approached Marbury with a thoughtful air. Did Rowena ever mention any previous threats to you? Any disputes, suspicions, or documents that might have worried her? Only once did she mention a figure from the past. She said someone from the old family still had power over her, but she didn't elaborate on it. It seemed to me more of an emotional concern than a legal one. The old family, Poirot repeated. Then he wasn't a stranger. He was someone very close, someone who didn't need to be mentioned to be present. He turned to Hastings, who was standing near the door. My friend, it's time to look again at Rowena's personal archive. Let's look for unsigned letters, handwritten notes, even drafts. Everything she didn't want to show, but didn't want to destroy either. In what part of the house? Poirot turned to the lawyer. Did she have a private desk? Marbury nodded. In her room. A lacquered secretary desk with hidden compartments. She inherited it from her husband. She always said that if something went missing, she'd hide it there. Poirot narrowed his eyes. So, Hastings, let's find someone. Hid the truth before trying to erase the past. Chapter 8. The Confessional Secretary. In the middle of the afternoon, Poirot and Hastings silently climbed the grand staircase of Wetherell Hall, its carpets muffling the footsteps of several generations. Rowena Wetherell's room, at the east end of the second floor, had remained untouched since her death, locked out of respect rather than official order. Edgar had given them the key without resistance, although his expression betrayed a certain discomfort. The room was spacious with high ceilings, heavy curtains, and an air of greyish solemnity. The walls, covered with family portraits, seemed like silent witnesses to an unfolding drama. At the far end, between an oval mirror and a display case of miniatures, stood the black lacquered writing desk. Its surface gleamed slightly, as if the piece of furniture itself were waiting to be opened with a mixture of resignation and defiance. Poirot stopped in front of the writing desk and interlaced his fingers. Do you know what distinguishes a well-made piece of furniture, Hastings? Symmetry? No, the intention. A good piece of furniture is a mask. It hides better than any human face. Now let's see what Madame Wetherell wanted to hide. With an ivory key found on the bedside table, Poirot opened the main panel. Inside were meticulously arranged papers, bank statements, personal letters, and a few postcards from past travels. Everything seemed too correct, too clean, Hastings muttered. Doesn't seem like the kind of place someone would hide a secret. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Exactly. But look at this false bottom. Look at the shadow line in the wood. Fainter on the right side. Do you see this indentation, my friend? Very carefully. He pressed a pen against the indicated spot. A soft click sounded from inside. Then, with a delicate movement, he slid back, a hidden wooden slat. A deep, narrow compartment appeared, from which he removed a package tied with a blue ribbon. Its contents: several handwritten sheets and an unstamped envelope. Poirot silently read the first paragraph of the loose letter. His face, though restrained, showed a wrinkle of tension at the corner of his lips. It's here. Here's the letter we were looking for. He handed Hastings the opened envelope. Inside, Rowena's same shaky handwriting read, I can't take it any more. He knows what happened that night. He told me without saying it. I saw it in his eyes, in the way he brushed my hand as he poured my tea. That phrase, you know what you did. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation to remember. He's dragging me back into the abyss of that decision. And now, after all these years, I feel like what I buried with Algernon was never really buried. I said it quietly, just once, and that was enough to bring him back. I've left another note in case something happens to me. Poirot paled slightly. A half-hearted confession, but with a clear recipient, and more importantly, a second note. Hastings checked the rest of the compartment. At the bottom something was taped down. A folded sheet of paper, written on both sides. Poirot took it and began to read extremely slowly. As his eyes scanned the text, his breathing became more measured, almost halting. This This is the key. What does it say?" Poirot didn't reply immediately. He walked to the window, holding the paper. "Here, Hastings." Rowena Wetherell records a fact she never revealed in life. One night, 20 years ago, she confronted Algernon after discovering suspicious correspondence. It wasn't a lover he was, hiding, but blackmail. Someone close to him, very close to the family, was threatening to reveal a financial fraud committed years earlier during wartime. Rowena found out too late. The very night of the confrontation, Algernon suffered what was described as a sudden heart attack, but Rowena always suspected it wasn't as natural as it seemed. Hastings stepped forward, astonished. "Are you implying that someone killed Algernon?" Not only that, she believed she'd provoked it with her emotional pressure. That fear, guilt, and discovery had hastened his death. That's why she kept silent. And now someone brought it all back, with a simple phrase, a phrase that only she and whoever was present that night could recognize. And who could that be? Poirot turned slowly, his gaze icy. Someone who knew about the letter, about the room, about the secret hidden in this desk. Someone with unrestricted access, without raising suspicion, and above all, someone who could imitate the voice of the past without using their own mouth. A manipulated recording? Yes. A setup, not just to frighten, but to break her, to push her toward a death without trace. It's the perfect crime, Hastings. A murder committed with memory and machinery. Poirot carefully put the sheets in his briefcase. Now we have what we were missing. The letter, the fear, the motive, but not the culprit. So what's the next step? Poirot looked down at the final page, where Rowena had written a sentence in large letters. "If anything happens to me, ask Violet. She'll know." Poirot murmured, "The Lady of the Shadows is becoming a central figure." Chapter 9. The Tea That Never Got Cold. The afternoon was just beginning to fade behind the stained glass windows of the west corridor when Poirot asked for a pot of tea for two. He didn't request service from the butler or the cook, but had everything brought to the Blue Room, where Miss Violet Carr was already seated. Upon receiving the news of the invitation, Violet showed no surprise. She arrived punctually, a grey shawl draped over her shoulders and an immutable, almost ecclesiastical expression. "A cup of tea, mademoiselle?" asked Poirot, pouring with precise hands. "Thank you. Tea is one of the few things that still holds its own in this house," she replied, accepting the cup without adding milk or sugar. Poirot watched her drink in silence for a few seconds before speaking. "Miss Carr, there is something I wish to discuss with you. I do so with respect, but also with the clarity that the moment demands." "Then speak bluntly, Monsieur Poirot." "We've found a letter written by Mrs. Wetherell, not one of her usual letters," he clarified with a slight gesture, "but a personal account hidden inside her writing desk. In it, she mentions an incident that occurred with her husband, Algernon, more than 20 years ago, and it also suggests that you would know who she feared. The silence that followed was as thick as the smoke rising from the teapot. Violet didn't blink. She just gently placed her cup back on its saucer. Rowena had an excellent memory, but also a tendency to magnify certain impressions. So you admit that you knew what the letter contained?" Violet looked up. There was no longer fog in her eyes, but a silent determination. "I imagined it. Rowena was never explicit, but we talked a lot more than anyone realized. I was there that night, the night Algernon died." Poirot nodded once, as if simply confirming a calculation. "And what really happened?" Rowena confronted him with the cards. He broke down. He said someone was blackmailing him, that they were going to ruin him. He didn't say a name. But when she demanded to know who it was, he just muttered, "It's closer than you think." Then he put his hand to his chest. He almost fell immediately. Rowena screamed. I ran to him, and there was nothing I could do. "And since then, have you kept it a secret?" Rowena felt guilty. She thought she'd pushed him. And I knew that if the blackmailer was still around, silence was the only thing that would protect us. Poirot perched on the edge of his chair. His voice dropped to a deep, compassionate tone. "Do you suspect who it was?" "Not then. But over the years, certain actions, certain gestures, made me think of Giles. The way he kept an eye on the household accounts, his resentment toward Rowena. But I could never prove it." Poirot stood up slowly and went to the window. From there he could see the garden, where the shadows were already lengthening on the damp grass. And yet the recorded phrase, "You know what you did," the same phrase Rowena heard that night, reappears now, not by accident, but by design. Violet watched him without responding. "Mademoiselle," said Poirot, turning to her, "what did you feel when you heard that recording for the first time?" "Cold. Not physical, but ancestral. As if the house were remembering something we're trying to forget." "And did you recognize the voice?" "No, not at first. But this morning, as I was closing a window in the West Wing, it hit me. It wasn't Algernon's voice. It was an imitation, but one done with hate. And that made me think of someone else." Poirot inclined his head. "Who? Not Giles. Someone younger, smarter, more careful." "Edgar." Poirot didn't react. He just pickened up his cup and took a quick sip. "What makes you think that?" "A few months ago, Edgar asked to see the mirror. He said he was interested in learning the technique of its assembly." "He was very specific. Too specific." And after that, Rowena started to get nervous. She started closing the desk, writing letters in secret. Edgar didn't want his aunt dead, not openly, but I think he wanted her legacy, unconditionally, without the risk of a confession that would change everything. Poirot approached slowly. "And you, mademoiselle, why are you telling me this now?" "Because I can't bear it any more. I've protected this memory for too long. I thought the past was dead, but you see, even the oldest tea retains its aroma." Poirot smiled slightly. "Sometimes, mademoiselle, the quietest soul is the one that best knows the notes of poison." Violet said nothing. She just looked up, dignified and resigned. "Are you going to charge him?" Poirot shook his head slowly. "Not yet. First, I need proof. Something that connects the present with the past. And I know where to look for it." "Where?" "In Edgar's audio room. He told me he recorded music as a hobby. But there's a difference. between recording and manipulating sounds. If my suspicion is correct, the mirror's voice didn't come from the past. It came from a modern archive, maybe even from a failed rehearsal. Poirot headed for the door. Before leaving, he turned around one last time. "Thank you for the tea, mademoiselle. It was revealing." Chapter 10. The Broken Voice Archive. The north wing of Wetherall Hall, a less travelled and recently renovated section, housed Edgar Wetherall's modest music room. Unlike the rest of the mansion, this room had a modern feel. Acoustic panels, neatly arranged cables, a sound console, and in one corner, a blonde wood desk with a collection of antique phonograph cylinders, digital recorders, and a carefully closed laptop. Poirot, accompanied by Hastings, entered unannounced. Edgar was standing there by the upright piano, leafing through some sheet music with a distracted expression. Seeing them, he straightened, visibly surprised. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, I didn't expect a visitor in this part of the house." "I suppose so, monsieur," said Poirot with measured kindness. "But there is one question that only this room can answer." A question. Poirot approached the desk and, without touching anything, indicated with his eyes the equipment arranged with almost clinical neatness. "I understand you have musical inclinations. Do you record your compositions?" Edgar nodded naturally. "When I have time. Experimental recordings. Really, sometimes I mix sounds, try out filters, nothing serious. Filters, yes, to alter the sound quality. Reproduce old effects, as if a modern recording were coming from a wax cylinder, for example." Poirot smiled slightly. What a delightful coincidence! Because the voice that appeared in the mirror was recorded precisely like that, with artificially added interference. It wasn't an original piece. It was a forgery. Careful, but identifiable. Edgar frowned. "Are you implying that I made it?" Poirot took a step closer, still in his gentle tone. "I'm not implying anything, sir. I'm asking you directly. Did you record that voice?" Edgar hesitated. Then he crossed his arms in a mixture of defence and restraint. "No. Why would I? Because your aunt was about to change the will. Because you knew about her letter to the lawyer. And because only you had access to the mirror, the cylinder, and the technology necessary to create an echo of the past. An echo designed to terrify. That's a very risky assumption, Poirot." "Oh, really? Then you won't mind if I check your computer." "You're not authorized to do that." Poirot nodded, as if he had expected the refusal. "Of course, I don't need to touch anything. Just let me see your recent files. And if you don't, I'll report my suspicions to the police and request a warrant." The silence that followed was heavy. Edgar lowered his gaze, then slowly walked to his laptop. He opened it, typed in his password, and turned the screen toward Poirot. "Go ahead. Find what you want." Poirot didn't hesitate. He browsed through the folders with the dexterity of someone accustomed to searching for the hidden in the obvious. In a folder titled Mix Tests, he found several audio files dated within the last 2 months. One in particular caught his attention. Test Final Few 3.wav. As it clicked, the room was filled with the same hoarse, distorted voice heard weeks earlier. From the mirror, "Rowena, you know what you did? and you know you're not alone." Poirot paused the file. Edgar had paled. "I didn't know that file was still there. I used it as evidence, an idea. I never showed it to anyone." "You never showed it? And how did it get into the cylinder?" "I don't know. Someone must have copied it. Maybe Clarissa, or Giles, or even Violet. Everyone's been in this room at some point." Poirot raised his hand, stopping the cascade of excuses. "Monsieur, it's not just about who touched the file. It's about intent. This recording was modified with specific filters, like those used to emulate antique cylinders. This isn't a game. You designed this recording with an emotional purpose. You studied the exact words that would resonate the trauma in your aunt's mind. I didn't mean to hurt him, but you did it. You didn't push her down the stairs. You didn't give her poison. You gave her fear, personalized fear, a fear you understood better than anyone because you'd grown up under your roof. You knew what to say. You knew what memory to trigger. And when you inserted that cylinder into the mirror, you weren't looking for murder. But you knew it could cause a catastrophe." Edgar slumped into the chair. The colour had drained from his face. I didn't think it would happen like this. The mind, monsieur, is like antique china. It breaks without a sound. You committed a crime without touching the victim, and you thought that made you innocent." Poirot switched off the equipment and headed for the door, but stopped. "One last question. Why that phrase? You know what you did." Edgar, almost breathless, murmured, "It was the phrase she whispered to me once when I was 10, after an argument between my parents. She looked me in the eyes as if she could see right through me. I never forgot it. I just wanted to give it back to her, remind her of it." Poirot nodded sadly, and when he reminded her, he destroyed her by Chapter 11, The Silent Meeting. The atmosphere at Wetherell Hall was as thick as the air before a storm. Conversations had become shorter, glances more cautious. The servants moved silently, aware that something was approaching, though no one dared to name it. At Poirot's request, Edgar, Giles, Clarissa, Violet and Elsie were summoned to the main hall at dusk. None of them knew the exact reason for the meeting, only that the celebrated detective had irrevocably requested their presence. Poirot, as usual, arrived last. He entered with gentle steps, unhurried, his hands clasped behind his back and his chin slightly raised. Beside him, Hastings walked with a grave expression, a small notebook in the inside pocket of his jacket. "My lords and ladies," Poirot began calmly, "the time has come to speak frankly. Not yet before the courts, but before each one's conscience. What happened in this house was not, on the face of it, a crime. There is no blood, no weapons, no witnesses, and yet Madame Rowena Wetherell is dead." A low murmur ran through the room, but no one spoke. What then remains if there is no proof? Poirot continued. The words, the gestures, the past. Because this death was sown long ago, with a sentence. He turned his gaze towards Edgar. "You know what you did." 5 words, as hard as fists, invisible as poison gas. They were spoken to you in childhood, Monsieur Edgar, and lived hidden in your memory like a thorn. until you found the opportunity to return them." Edgar didn't respond. He stared at the ground, his hands trembling. "You didn't kill her with direct intent, but you recorded that phrase. You manipulated it, turned it into a threat in the voice of a ghost, and hid it in the most symbolic place possible. The greenhouse mirror, an object your aunt associated with memories of her husband. You knew that upon hearing it she would remember, not the crime, but the guilt. And that guilt killed her." Clarissa covered her mouth with her hand. Giles sat up in his chair with an expression of disbelief that soon turned into something suspiciously pleased. "And what evidence do you have?" he asked coldly. Poirot replied without changing his tone. "The recording was found on Edgar's computer. Dated, rehearsed, edited. That's enough. But that's not all. We also found the letter Rowena wrote to her lawyer, announcing her intention to change the will. And we found something else. A second hidden note where she records her fear and her suspicion. She mentioned that if anything happened to him, we should ask Violet Carr. Everyone looked at Violet, who didn't flinch. Her expression, serene and controlled, seemed to have already moved on. And I've spoken to her," Poirot continued. "She told me what she witnessed 20 years ago, the night Algernon Wetherall died after an argument with his wife. What seemed like a heart attack was the result of a truth that weighed too heavily on her." Rowena remained silent from then on, until the words returned. Elsie, the maid, shifted in her seat. "But was it Edgar who placed the cylinder then?" "Yes, he did it during the mirror's restoration, with the help of his technical knowledge. And not only that, he knew that you, Mademoiselle Elsie, would be the one to discover it. You, the most impressionable, the most honest. He knew your reaction would be genuine, and that would convince everyone that the discovery was accidental." Elsie put a hand to her chest, shocked. "I didn't know, I swear." Poirot nodded politely. "I know. You were a piece on the board, not a player." Then he looked back at Edgar. "Monsieur, your crime wasn't one of passion or greed. It was a crime of psychological architecture. You built a stage, and as in every stage, the final silence is what determines success or disaster." Edgar, his eyes moist, stood up. "I didn't want him to die. I just wanted him to know what it feels like, what it's like to live with a shadow hanging over him, like he made me live." Poirot watched him with unjudgmental sadness, and in doing so, he inherited that shadow. A long silence fell over the room. No one seemed inclined to speak, not even Giles, who had been burdened with other people's suspicions for so long. Finally, it was Violet who stood up. "What will happen now?" Poirot clasped his hands. "That will depend on the courts. I'll present my findings to the police. It will be a slow and peculiar process, because the law still doesn't have adequate words for crimes committed with the soul, not the hands." Poirot stepped back, as if his work was at an end. "But morally, mademoiselle, this case is already solved. Guilt is not measured only in actions, but in consequences. And this crime, silent as a whisper, has screamed from the moment someone manipulated a voice to revive a ghost." Chapter 12. The Last Reflection. The next morning dawned dazzlingly clear. as if the sky had finally dared to lift the grey veil that had enveloped Wetherall Hall for weeks. But inside the mansion, the atmosphere was one of tense calm, the kind that follows a confession and precedes a resolution. Detective Constable Hargreaves arrived early, accompanied by a junior officer carrying a folder containing copies of the evidence Poirot had collected. The doctored recording, Edgar's computer files, the hidden letter, and Violet Carr's transcribed testimony. Poirot met them in the library, where it had all begun. Edgar was led away without resistance, not handcuffed, but with his back straighter than usual, as if the final fall had allowed him to regain at least some dignity. He didn't object. He didn't shout or plead. He only said one sentence as he passed Poirot. "Thank you for not letting everything rot in silence." When the door closed behind him, Poirot stood motionless for a few seconds. Hastings, who had been watching him from a corner, approached gently. It wasn't an easy case. No, my friend, because the truth, when hidden behind memory, reveals itself not as an open wound, but as an invisible scar. This crime was bloodless, but it has left much deeper marks. Do you think justice will be enough? Poirot raised his eyebrows slightly. Human justice is rarely complete, but it's the only mirror we have, and like any mirror, it shows only what it dares to reflect. Hours later, in the greenhouse, Poirot returned alone. The place had been aired out since the small fire, and no longer smelled of ash, but it retained an ancient nostalgia, as if the flowers knew something had happened here that altered the rhythm of time. The mirror frame was stored in a wooden box, ready to be sent to the authorities as evidence. Poirot opened it slowly. The polished wood, the Baroque carvings, the invisible cracks. There was no glass now, only the outline of what had once projected faces and secrets. He sat down on the stone bench in front of where he used to hang. In the darkest cases, he murmured to himself, one finds the truth not in the facts, but in the gestures, a word, a pause, a look that doesn't hold. Science can tell us how someone died, but only the soul tells us why. A figure approached behind him. "Violet Carr, can I sit down?" Poirot nodded. There was no need for words between them for a moment. "Do you think," he finally asked, "that Rowena would have forgiven Edgar?" "No," Violet replied with calm sincerity. "But I wouldn't have destroyed it either. That's what made her different from the others. She knew more than she was letting on. It's just that she was tired of carrying it alone." Poirot looked at her with a slight inclination of his head. "And you, who will accompany you now?" "I was already living among ghosts, Monsieur Poirot. One more. It won't change the silence." As evening fell, Poirot and Hastings were preparing to leave. The carriage was loaded, and Dinsmore, faithful to the end, offered them a thermos of tea for the journey. "It's not Madame Wetherall's recipe," he said, "but it might comfort you." Poirot accepted with a slight smile. "Sometimes, Mr. Dinsmore, what you need is not the exact flavour, but the gesture that accompanies it." As the car rolled along the gravel drive, moving away from the house, Hastings looked out the window at the grey windows, the dark rooftops, the trees like motionless witnesses. The greenhouse stood to one side, solitary, but with a quiet dignity, like a theatre closed after its last performance. "What do you plan to do now?" Hastings asked. "Rest. maybe read, or rearrange my socks, which have been thrown into disarray by intense thinking. And then another case. Poirot smiled. There will always be another crime, Hastings, but this one has taught me that sometimes the hardest thing to see isn't the hidden evidence, but the reflection we avoid looking at. The car disappeared around the bend in the road as Wetherell Hall, with all its secrets, fell behind, and in shed the empty frame of the mirror. If one looked closely enough, one could imagine one last image, not of a victim nor of a culprit, but of a truth finally set free. Epilogue: The Mirror That Never Broke. Weeks after leaving Wetherell Hall, Poirot and Hastings met again in London. The rain tapped softly on the windows of 14 Faraway Street, where Poirot had rented a small but immaculate room to reorganize his files and, as he said, allow the grey cells to breathe. Hastings, settled into an armchair with his usual cup of tea, was leafing through the Daily Telegraph. On the third page, a discreet headline caught his attention. Young Kentish heir acquitted of criminal responsibility in emotional manipulation case. Look at this, Poirot. It seems Edgar Wetherell has been released. The judge ruled there was no direct intent to kill, although he acknowledged moral responsibility. Ah, yes, I expected as much, Poirot replied without looking up from his notebook. The law is still uncomfortable with crimes without physical contact. But the soul, Hastings, does not so easily escape the verdict of its own conscience. So, you think you've escaped punishment? Poirot closed the notebook with precision. Escaped? No, he's been acquitted, but he's been condemned to live knowing that his desire to return a wound ended up taking a life. That kind of punishment doesn't have a prison cell, but it doesn't have freedom either. Hastings nodded slowly, then changed the subject. Do you know what I still don't understand? The figure of Violet Carr. She was on the sidelines, but present throughout, like a shadow. Do you think she knew more than she said? Poirot smiled faintly, stood up, and walked to the window. She knew exactly what she needed to know. Violet wasn't an accomplice, but she was a guardian, of secrets, of silences, and of Rowena's pain. She was the moral mirror of this story, Hastings. Not the one that projects the image, but the one that absorbs the light without reflecting it. That's why she survived, and what happened to her. According to a letter I received this morning, he's left Wetherell Hall. He's travelled to Dorset, apparently. He's taken a cottage by the sea. He likes to watch the waves because, as he wrote in his letter, the sea does not repeat what it reflects. Hastings frowned. Poetic or guilty? Poirot shrugged. Both, maybe, but not criminal. A comfortable pause settled between the two. The fireplace crackled softly, and the clock struck 6. Poirot, suddenly energetic, turned to his desk and took out a lacquered wooden box with gilt details. What's that? The mirror frame, said Poirot. Hastings almost choked on his tea. Did you bring it with you? Yes, I was allowed to keep it, as a piece of analysis after it was ruled out as a dangerous object. But I don't want it as evidence, but as a reminder. He opened the box. Inside, the mahogany frame, now stripped of its device, glass, and function, lay like an ancient relic, weightless, voiceless, and threatening. And what does it remind you of exactly? Poirot answered bluntly. That evil rarely appears in the iodice guise of crime. It often hides behind the faces we think we know. And the most dangerous thing is not what a mirror shows, but what the soul refuses to see. Hastings leaned forward. So, what did you see in this case? Poirot touched the edge of the frame. I saw a family trapped by their own reflections. I saw a woman who lived among lies, but died for the truth. And I saw a young man who, believing he had healed a wound, created a new one. He placed the frame inside the box and closed it with a soft click. But most of all, Hastings, I saw the future of crime. Silent, emotional, gunless and bloodless. A crime committed indoors, leaving invisible corpses. And are you prepared to face them? Poirot looked out the window once more, where the rain fell steadily, washing the rooftops of London as if the city too were seeking redemption. Always, as long as human secrets exist, my little grey cells will have work to do. The clock struck its last chime of the day. Poirot picked up his walking stick, put on his hat with geometric precision, and turned toward the door. Come, mon ami. There's a telegram on my desk. A Mrs. Denham from Brighton has lost her husband, but she sees him every day. Hastings stood up, puzzled. A ghost? Poirot smiled. Or a good costume. And together, without further words, they set out to meet the next mystery. Postlude, the voice that keeps speaking. 3 months after the Wetherall Hall incident, in a London recording studio, a dark-haired, thin-faced woman adjusted her headphones as the technician adjusted the sound levels. The illuminated sign of an air flashed red above the door. It was the first episode of a new podcast series titled Crimes Without Traces, and its creator, journalist, and former cultural researcher Adela March knew that her career depended on a single episode, the one that would tell the story of Rowena Wetherall. Adela had followed Edgar's trial with obsessive attention. The acquittal had sparked quiet controversy in legal circles, but the public hadn't forgotten. How could someone kill without touching, without poison, without a single stain? What is punished, and what is left unpunished? The microphone picked up his breathing, then his voice. Today we will talk about a death that left no visible wounds, about a crime constructed with the precision of a composer and the cruelty of an ancient confession. This is the story of the voice in the mirror, and of the heir who believed a memory could be justice. At the same moment, hundreds of miles to the south, Poirot was walking along a coastal path in Sussex. The breeze was salty and fresh, and seagulls circled above the cliffs. Beside him, Violet Carr moved slowly with an ebony walking stick, her light grey coat billowing like a loose sail. "Do you mind if we talk about this case on the radio?" she asked without turning around. "Not at all," Poirot replied. "Sometimes a crime needs to be told more than once, so that the truth reaches those who didn't know they were also involved." Violet nodded. She was looking toward the horizon, but Poirot, as always, was observing something else. The angle of her hands, the slight tremor of her lips, the pause before each sentence. Subtle signs that told him more than words. "Adela March," Violet said with a hint of irony, Was the niece of one of Algernon's partners, you know. Poirot raised his eyebrows. No, but I'm glad you mentioned it. It means this case isn't over yet. And do you think there's still something left to say? Poirot stopped beside a white rock, where seaweed tangled like forgotten secrets. He took a carefully folded letter from his coat, received the previous week. I received it from an anonymous listener of Adela's show. It said something very curious. If you look at the back of Algernon's portrait, you'll find the original tape. Not everything recorded was actually heard. Violet paled. The portrait? Oui. The one that hung in the South Wing gallery. No one thought of it, because no one thought the mirror was just part of the echo. There was a long silence. Will you look for him? She asked finally. Poirot smiled. I already did. The portrait was stored in an art conservator's office in Bloomsbury. The tape carefully sealed in the back frame. It's 20 years old. An actual recording. Algernon's voice saying exactly the same words. Rowena, you know what you did. Only then he said it with a laugh. It was part of an inside joke, a home recording. Taken out of context, it became a sentence. Violet slowly closed her eyes. So the phrase wasn't invented. It was recycled. Exactly. Edgar didn't know about that recording. He only remembered hearing that phrase as a child, his aunt's voice. But he didn't know that what he thought was a condemnation was, in fact, an echo of a private scene. A banal phrase that grew like a shadow. And now, Poirot put the letter in his pocket. Now, the crime is even more perfect, because it was chance that chose the words. Edgar was guilty of the execution, not the idea. The real murderer was confusion, misinterpreted memory, the poorly explained past. Can one forgive that? Poirot shrugged. Maybe, but you can't forget. Nor should you. The sea roared at the foot of the cliff. And Poirot, his eyes on the horizon, knew this mystery would never have a clean ending. Some truths faded with time. Others were forever etched in the voice of someone who could no longer speak for himself. Do you know what I learned from this case, Mademoiselle Carr? That the mirror was never the object. It was the symbol. It doesn't reflect what we see. It reflects what we think we saw. And with that phrase, the great Belgian detective walked away along the coast, leaving behind not only the scene of a crime, but also the echo of a story that would still speak to anyone who knew how to listen. Epilogue. Sexulo, the footprint that was nobody's. A month later, a figure dressed in a trench coat and dark hat strode calmly into London's National Library. Although the day was clear, his presence seemed to carry with it something of the twilight at Wetherell Hall. A ghostly calm, a distant echo. The figure was Poirot. He had requested access to a set of personal letters from Algernon Wetherell's private collection, recently donated by a distant relative to the Historical Documentation Archive. No one had thought those papers held any value beyond sentimentality. But Poirot knew better. Crime, like a disease left untreated, often left spores in the recesses of the past. In a quiet reading room, under the light of a desk lamp, Poirot, wearing white gloves, untied the ribbon that bound the bundle. Inside, in aged envelopes and yellowed sheets, was correspondence between Algernon and a certain A.T., whose identity was not clarified by any heading. The letters began affectionately, then took on a disturbing tone. Veiled blackmail, references to loans, debts, and stolen confidences, and then a sentence. I don't need you to pay me. Just keep quiet. Remember, what's on tape can't be unrecorded. Poirot tilted his head slightly. It wasn't Rowena's handwriting, nor Violet's, but something about that stroke seemed vaguely familiar. He turned the pages one by one until he came to a partial signature, just the initial. A.T. Poirot sat up slowly. He wasn't part of the already solved case, nor of the already read will, but that letter hinted at a shadowy figure. A third party, someone who had been involved long before, not in Rowena's death, but in Algernon's downfall. The next day, Poirot made an appointment with Miss Adela March. The journalist, surprised by the request, welcomed him into her small studio, surrounded by microphones and stacks of folders containing notes on the Wetherall case. Her expression, after the initial greeting, changed from respect to concern, as Poirot placed a yellow envelope containing a copy of the letter signed A.T. on the table. "What is this? A fragment of the story you didn't include in your podcast," Poirot said mildly. "Or that you couldn't include because you didn't know it was part of it." Della lowered her gaze. For a few seconds, the silence vibrated between them like a taut string. "The handwriting is your mother's, right?" She nodded without speaking. Her mother, Annalisa Turner, was Algernon's personal secretary in the 1940s. According to the records, she left the country under unclear circumstances, following a series of financial disagreements. Rowena mentioned her once, vaguely. And now we discover that the original tape could have been a warning recorded by her. "What if that's how it was?" Adela asked in a subdued voice. "That doesn't change what Edgar did." "No, but it changes the origin of the phrase. And most importantly, it shows that the echo that killed Rowena didn't come from her son, but from a past neither of them fully understood." Poirot leaned towards her. "You're not responsible for what your mother did, but you had the right to know everything before you turned it into a narrative. And you, Poirot, what will you do with this?" "Nothing more," he replied, standing up, "because this crime has already taken its toll. I don't need another scandal. I just wanted to close the door. Properly." He headed for the door, but before leaving, he stopped. There's something poetic about how this story wrote itself. Recordings that return, misinterpreted echoes, words that don't fade, like the ripples from a stone thrown into a pond, that travel much further than we think. Adela remained silent as Poirot left. Only when the door closed did she look at the letter again, and he understood that sometimes the truth doesn't have a face, only a shadow. That evening, at his desk back, at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot wrote one last entry in his case notebook. "Guilt is like a poorly edited recording. The listener thinks he hears a threat, but often he hears only his own reflection. In this case, there was no killer in the classic sense. There were echoes, there were burdens, and there was fear. And in that fear, Mrs. Wetherall died." Purgedy closed his notebook, aligned his pen with mathematical precision, and poured himself a cup of herbal tea. Then, without a sound, he turned off the lamp. Appendix: the words nobody wrote. A few weeks after his conversation with Adela March, Poirot found himself once again in his study at Whitehaven Mansions, cloistered among columns of filed papers and carefully organised notes. Although the Wetherell Hall case was officially over, something remained suspended unfinished. Not a loose thread. Poirot detested untied ends, but a feeling, the intuition that the story, even in its closure, continued to whisper. That intuition took concrete form one December morning, when I received a letter with no return address. The pale grey envelope was written in uneven handwriting, as if the hand writing it had trembled. Poirot opened the envelope with a slow gesture. Inside was a sheet of paper folded in 4. The message read, "You saw everything except this. The original tape wasn't the only one. There was another. It was never played, it was never used, but it was recorded. By me. I was there. I listened, and I also kept quiet. Because we all keep quiet, Monsieur Poirot. Not out of fear, out of shame." There was no signature, just an initial in faded ink, E. Poirot stood motionless, the note suspended between his fingers. Hastings, who had just entered with 2 cups of coffee, stopped when he saw his friend's face. Another puzzle. Poirot nodded briefly. An unexpected one, but revealing. Who is E? It could be anyone, Edgar, Elsie, even someone who was never on our list. But more important than who is what they say. There was another recording, never used. That implies the plan was more complex than we suspected. Do you think there was an alternative plan? Poirot didn't reply immediately. Instead, he walked to the window. Outside, London stretched out in a winter light, translucent and shadowless, and yet, in the detective's mind, those shadows lingered. Not a plan, Hastings. A fear. Maybe someone else knew the phrase before Edgar. Maybe Edgar wasn't the first to hear it, but the last. Maybe that tape, the one that was never used, was meant for another time, for another victim. Are you saying Rowena's death could have been a coincidence? Or a repeat? The echo of a previous attempt, of a warning that became a habit. Perhaps someone accustomed to manipulating without, killing, this time went too far. Hastings sat down, still confused. "And what do you propose to do? Investigate again?" Poirot shook his head. "No, my friend. The case is settled before the law. But when faced with the truth, sometimes all one can do is leave a record, because some voices don't seek justice. They just want to be heard before they disappear." He opened his personal notebook and, with his favourite pen, wrote a new entry, outside the index, without a date. The unused tape, the unspoken message, the shadow that stood there without a name. This is neither proof nor accusation. It's a warning. The perfect crime isn't one that leaves no trace. It's one that masquerades as human emotion. Closing the notebook, Poirot stared at the shelf where, among the volumes on law, philosophy and criminology, rested a thin, pale wooden box. Inside, the original tape found behind Algernon's portrait. He hadn't handed it over to the authorities. No one had asked for it, perhaps because no one wanted to hear it again. But Poirot, with his sense of order, didn't destroy it. He preserved it like a warning. That evening, as the gramophone played a Debussy adagio, Poirot indulged himself in a cup of hot chocolate and a final thought. When he closed his eyes, he didn't think about culprits or victims. He thought about something more complex. How emotions, like sounds, could be distorted, filtered, reproduced in contexts that rendered them unrecognizable and lethal. And as the adagio ended on a suspended chord, Poirot thought, there are crimes that don't end with an arrest. They end when the last whisper no longer finds a listening ear. Final chapter. The unexpected reflection. Winter had enveloped London in an atmosphere of introspection. The fog rose from the Thames like a thick whisper, floating over lit lanterns and damp cobblestones. In his apartment in Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot was preparing to close a chapter that had, until now, refused to close on its own. The anonymous letter signed E, found weeks earlier, had suggested a second tape, a recording that had never been used. And although Poirot wasn't one for leaving questions unanswered, he also knew when a mystery should wait, and when it should be summoned back into the light. Today, I had an appointment with the answer. The meeting took place in a discreet café in Bloomsbury. Poirot waited at a table in the far corner, where the reflections from the window didn't quite touch the tablecloth. A cup of herbal tea was steaming in front of him. At 11 o'clock sharp, the door opened, and a thin figure in a dark coat and with a tired face entered without hesitation and sat down silently. Era Elsie Chapman. Not as the trembling girl who had served tea at Wetherell Hall, but as a determined woman burdened with secrets she finally wanted to let out. Poirot was direct. You wrote the letter, didn't you? Elsie nodded. Not out of cowardice, out of protection. There are things that weigh more than the law. The other tape, he asked, with no need to feign surprise. It exists, but it wasn't recorded by Edgar, or by Rowena. It was recorded by me. Poirot watched her with an interest he only showed when something truly unexpected emerged. Explain yourself, mademoiselle. Years ago, I heard Rowena talking to herself in the greenhouse. I thought she was delirious. But then I started recording her. I used one of the old cylinders Mr. Algernon had collected, not out of malice, but because she seemed expecting to be heard by someone who was no longer alive. It was sad. It was beautiful. It was haunting. Elsie took an object out of her bag, a small wooden box. She placed it on the table. This is the original tape. Rowena spoke to the mirror. She said, You know what you did. But she didn't tell anyone else. It was for herself. Poirot reverently opened the box. Inside was a wax cylinder, carefully wrapped in silk. So the phrase wasn't Algernon's or Edgar's. It was hers. Yes, Elsie confirmed. Edgar was just repeating something he'd heard as a child. He didn't know he'd heard it from his aunt, not his uncle. And when he recorded it, he thought he was hitting back. But really, he was answering himself. Poirot leaned back in his chair. A larger, more twisted structure was revealed, one where every character, even those who seemed secondary, was actually an essential part. Why hide it all this time? Because Rowena never wanted anyone to know. That tape was her private purge, her way of confessing without confessing. I kept it out of affection, then out of fear, and then out of habit. Poirot inclined his head. "You are the last witness, the last guardian of the echo." Elsie stood up. "I just wanted someone to know the truth before it became a legend." "Think of you, mademoiselle," Poirot said with genuine respect. "You have just solved the final problem in this case." That evening, back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot placed the cylinder in his personal phonograph. Hastings watched from across the room, glass in hand. "Are you sure you want to hear it?" Poirot nodded. The needle touched the wax, a crackling, as if memories were being dusted off. Then the voice, soft, broken, but clear. "You know what you did, Rowena. You know when it started. It wasn't with Algernon. It was before. It was when you first fell silent. And you liked the silence." Poirot turned off the recorder before the tape ended. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if protecting the privacy of a soul that was no longer with him. "So it was a self-inflicted punishment," Hastings murmured. "That's right, mon ami." Rowena judged herself. Edgar merely acted as a mirror. The real crime was a chain of reflections, each believing the other was to blame. But no one was the murderer. And then Poirot rose calmly, crossed the living room, and looked out of the window at the lights of the city. So, this was a tragedy disguised as a mystery, a web of misinterpreted memories, of words torn from their context. A mirror that reflected back what each of us was afraid to see. He turned to Hastings. "And sometimes that, my friend, is more fatal than a weapon." The next day, Poirot wrote his final report on the case. It wouldn't be sent to any police force. It wouldn't be given to any lawyer. It was his alone. A personal conclusion to a crime that didn't want to be one, and a reflection that was never clear. Mrs. Rowena Wetherell died by the force of her own memory. The instrument was a recording. The hand that activated it was that of a wounded young man. But the echo came from deeper. No one killed her, and yet everyone pushed her. At the bottom of the page, he signed in his perfect handwriting, "Hercule Poirot," and in the lower corner he wrote with a firm and definitive stroke, "Case closed. Tools